Hello, and welcome to another edition of Your Therapist Needs Therapy, the podcast where two mental health professionals talk about their mental health journey and how they navigate mental wellness while working in the mental health field. I'm your host, Jeremy Schumacher, licensed marriage and family therapist. To support the show, head over to patreon.com/wellnesswithjer. I like to joke that I am a mental health professional, not a professional podcaster. So likes, shares, support, leaving a review, all that stuff is helpful in our modern algorithm-driven world. Super stoked today for my guest, a local therapist that I'm excited to connect with and talk about her work and also talk about some topics we haven't covered a ton in the podcast yet. So I'm very excited to be joined by Madeleine Doelker Berlin. Madeleine, thanks for joining me today.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I start every podcast with the same question, which is, how is it that you came to be in the mental health field?
Okay. It's been a long journey, and not. So I'm originally from Germany. I feel like that is kind of relevant to everything at this point. I originally wanted to take a completely different path as a career. Like I wanted to be in politics. I have a political science degree. And then later on, I got a master's degree in social sciences. And I thought that I would be working for members of parliament or something like that, like preparing, writing speeches, that kind of stuff. And I did that for a while. I was an intern for a member of parliament in Germany and worked on a book with him. And then once I started my social sciences master's degree, I relocated to Berlin and needed a job on the side and kind of like fell into homeless services, which I think for the first time in my entire life, I like felt like I was in the right place. Like I often felt like a sense of misplacement or like not fully fitting in. And then like homeless services was my jam.
Yeah.
Like I was there, I was like, and then, so I finished my master's degree, and throughout that, my area of research was homelessness and social inequality and oppression. And so I did my master's thesis on homelessness in Germany, and ended up just like pivoting to that area and became a case manager. You would call it case manager in the US. It's not really a case manager in Germany, but became a case manager in homeless services. And really loved that. Did that for a bit, and then and that is huge overlap with mental health services, because most people, at least in Germany, it's different in the US, but most people in Germany who are in homeless services often have mental health concerns, a lot of schizophrenia, a lot of substance use. That's like the two main, borderline personality disorder. And so I worked a bunch with clients who had maybe undiagnosed or diagnosed severe mental health concerns, and I really liked it a lot. And then I relocated to the US because my husband's here and wanted to continue in homeless services, and figured, like, lived in Southern California. I worked in Southern California in homeless services with families there. And then we relocated to Milwaukee, and I worked in homeless services here. And along the way, I just figured out that homeless services in the US were a very different beast than in Germany. A lot of that has to do with availability of resources, a lot, but also how people are being treated, and what is required of them, and how it always felt like people kind of have to like earn their right to get compassion and help, which I think was not as much the case in Germany. There was just money and resources available, it's like,
I was gonna guess a lot of that has to do with the social safety net that's available.
Absolutely. It's completely different. I mean, people just get money in Germany. They're like, here you go, monthly money, and here you go, we pay for an apartment for you forever. And here it's like, so everything is so tight financially, and then people just, and then I mean, the biggest thing is that Wisconsin is an open record state, and that makes it so hard for people with felonies to get housing. And so things like that were just really hard. And I think structural issues are always really tough on me, because especially because I come from a place where it was better. So I know how it can be better, how it can be so
Right.
much better. And then you're here and all of a sudden, like, everyone is competing for resources, and it's just, I was like, I can't do this anymore. And so I decided to move on. And while I was already I had already thought about that I would really like to be in substance use counseling. And so I just went back to school and got my counseling degree and focused on substance use counseling. And then again, I was like, oh, I can't really move on from homeless population or from like population that just need extra help, because I always felt like I'm super lucky. I was born privileged. I'm from a middle class family. My parents are great. I went to school for free because I went to school in Germany. I always felt like I had so much that I could like spare some of what I had gotten. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah. And then I was like, not shying away from particularly difficult sets of clients or people that are deemed difficult by some people. And so I was like, well, I could do mandated clients. And so my internship was in that setting, and I figured out it didn't sit right with me. I felt like honestly I was part of a system of oppression. It's just not.
Yeah.
It was like I didn't like how I was a counselor for clients who were on federal probation parole, and a lot of the people working in that system genuinely wanted good, but then at the same time, I didn't think that they were meeting clients' needs how I would have wanted them to be met. And there are some things with like confidentiality that are very different there, and that is the biggest part for me. I was like, no, this is not. It's not for me. And so after that, I had to and that also coincided with me being an immigrant and having having basically to settle in the US. And so I felt a lot of like identity issues at that point. So I had to step back for a moment. I then had 2 children and went back to homeless services just to confirm again that I can't be in homeless services anymore. And I worked in a daycare for a year, which was not something for me, but I learned so much, and that was really amazing. And then at one point I was like, okay, what I'm gonna do now? And I finally, at one point I was like had this epiphany where I was like, oh my God, I would love to be a counselor now. Before I wasn't ready. And then I had the degree and I was like, I really would love to be a counselor. And especially the kind of counselor that I thought I didn't have access to when at one point I had been in counseling actually but in my early 20s I had counseling, and that was really helpful. And then when I came to Milwaukee, I really wanted someone to help me with this transition of being an immigrant in Milwaukee, and I just couldn't find anyone. It was and the way my personality is not necessarily something that your standard Milwaukeean white woman would be like. And so I just felt so much like I didn't fit in. And then I'm an immigrant, and it was so weird. And I tried to find a counselor who would understand. And I think I couldn't find anyone. I couldn't find anyone who could actually the experience of immigration, especially when you're grown up, is so bizarre and so weird in so many ways. So I was like, and I want to be the 3 main things that for me were super relevant that I was like, I wish I had a counselor for that, was navigating motherhood, women's mental health, and immigration. Those were the 3 fields where it's I wish I had someone available who would relate more to me and the kind of person I am, and so my background. And so it's like, whoa, what if I'm a counselor for other people now that I've gone through all of this? So I started my own private practice. Sorry, it's a long story.
No. I start with that question because it opens up so many avenues of conversation.
Okay.
I have yet to have a guest who has a linear process in this
Yeah,
field. Um, I want to talk about the immigration, and it's a topic
Mhm,
I've talked about with one of my other guests.
mhm,
But while homelessness is part of it, I do want to talk about that a little bit because in the U.S., a lot of the mental health providers who are working with that population are interns, are students.
mhm,
My first internship was at Hope House in Milwaukee, which is a
mhm,
homeless shelter down near the Third Ward, and like I was so ill-equipped
mhm.
to work with that population as a student, but because the burnout rate is so high for people who are working there, that's just where they place students. And so you have these people who are in crisis, in a high level of need, working with providers who are not well qualified to be working with
Yeah,
them. And then you just have this burnout cycle. So the system for people who are dealing with being unhoused doesn't support them. We don't have a social safety net. And then we don't have the support for the mental health providers we're trying to send their way either.
yeah.
And so I think that burnout process is very high
Mhm,
because the system sucks, and then we don't have the resources to support either the people who are in the system or the professionals who
mhm.
are trying to be helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I think, yeah, and I think honestly, it's Milwaukee. There, a lot of it has to do with race as well. I do think there's just not
Yep.
enough providers of color, um, and that is what is really needed. It's
Mm.
like honestly, like me stepping in there and trying to help people who felt like there was nothing that connected them to me, or like my experience had nothing to do with theirs. I don't blame them. It's
Right.
true.
Yeah.
It's true. And I think that is a huge thing. And I mean, there's just not enough funding available for clients in particular,
Right.
um, for providers. It's a burnout machine, unfortunately. It's just
Yeah. And not when you personally had the experience of knowing there is a better system
Mhm.
and then not being able to do that. And like, because as someone who's born in America, like I also knew there was a better system. This isn't like a mystery, it's a
Yeah,
policy choice.
yeah,
We know how to increase outcomes for people. We know that meeting their basic needs creates a lot of positive benefit right away,
yeah,
right? That solves
yeah,
so much.
yeah,
And we don't do that for a
yeah.
policy choice. And so I think like too, as a provider, it's really hard to stay in there when you're like, I'm part of this machine that is unhelpful on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. I think that is I just didn't want to be complicit. I think that's
Hmm.
I think you feel to a certain degree it feels dirty sometimes to be part of that system that
Yeah.
and doesn't benefit, because really, like, if people just had housing and a regular irregular income of in some way or
Right.
shape, some people, let's face it, some people cannot work. Like, some people cannot work because
Yeah.
their mental health is just interfering with it too much. And
Right.
it it's yeah. People just their well-being increases so much more if they don't have to like hustle for food and housing
Right.
all the time.
Yeah.
It's like a hustle for people all the time. It's constant, like go, 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 go.
Yeah. Yeah. And that the messaging in America for so long has been it is a personal failing. And so there's like this judgment on being unhoused is someone's fault, and it's that person's fault, even though
Yeah.
most of us in America, if unless we're independently wealthy, most
Mhm.
of us are a major life catastrophe away from being unhoused.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think what is very interesting is with COVID, what happened is that all of a sudden everyone went on pause, and most people had been hustling, 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 and all of a sudden they had time to step back and be like, is this the life I want? Like, people don't have time to think about
Right.
long-term goals. And I think that was the only time I can think of where like collectively people had the experience of like understanding that there's a difference between your everyday hustle and how it affects your thinking about the future, and like
Yeah.
actually have time to think for a moment.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that is something for a lot of unhoused people. It's just their brain is in survival mode. They cannot access any like long-term
Right.
planning capacity or
Yeah.
even stick with it. I think that's the other thing. Like, if you're so
Right.
busy trying to make sure you get food and housing and like And then fulfilling all the requirements that the 10 case managers you might have for you.
Well, and you brought up the confidentiality piece. Like, right, it is it's part of the overall police state of like, you're supposed to be keeping your eyes on these people. Are they doing the right things? Like, there are all these like, for a lot of shelters, there are requirements for, are you trying to get a job? Are you doing these things? Are you like meeting your deadlines? And so as a provider, you're like roped into it, even with pushback and say, no, I can't share that. That's not ethical. Like, the clients you're working with are skeptical of the process because everyone in their life is observing them to tell on them, not to support them.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it's a form of infantilization of people. And I think that is the exact opposite of what people need. You know, like, if you want to show respect to people, you trust them, you don't infantilize them, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's accountability and there's infantilization, you know, and I think it's on the infantilization often, the system.
Right. And that feeds into the personal choice narrative that like, you were a naughty child, you go into timeout. And like, and you brought up COVID, and it's such a frustrating topic. I'm married to a teacher. I work with a lot of medical professionals, a lot of people who were the essential care workers. Like, nothing got better for them. We all sort of acknowledged like, hey, we need these people for society, and then just did nothing to support them.
Yeah, we gave them
what happened. We put out yard signs that said, thank you for all your work. But like, what happened when everyone could pause is we said, hey, like, the police state is bad. Let's protest. We said things like, people matter more than property. And that was really scary for our capitalistic society. And so then it's like the move to go back to the office and not work from home, that like, it's cranked up to 11 for the unhoused population, that their needs aren't met. And they can't think. But like, that's true for just capitalism as well. Like, busy, produce, enjoy your weekend, then back to work, so that we're not talking about social changes. So we're not trying to change the structure.
Yeah. And making consumption basically being your pastime. So it's like, that's another job, basically. It's like, it's like, when you have free time, how about you go shopping, you know, so that you don't stop and think. It's
right. Yeah. It's maddening.
It is maddening. It's frustrating.
So we've accurately highlighted that the system is broken. What is it like? I've never, as a mental health provider, never provided services in another country. What is it like in Germany then? When I started my career, the Affordable Care Act hadn't been passed. I worked at a low-fee clinic where people who didn't have insurance came for therapy. And so it was the similar population, lots of schizophrenia, lots of untreated chronic mental health issues. And so what is sort of the approach in Germany then for like mental health? Is it seen as like this thing that we want to support and help them? Is there a stigma attached to it still? What does that look like?
There is a stigma. I think that's a very complex question, because there is a stigma attached to it for sure. But I think just like the regular baseline of social support among people in Germany is much higher, you know, not just like in homeless services, but just in life. I feel like social support, social cohesion, I don't know if that rings a bell. It's a sociology term, basically means like how much people trust each other in a society. Social cohesion is much higher in Germany. I mean, to be fair, I've not lived in Germany for 10 years, so things have changed significantly, actually. But when I was there, social cohesion was much higher, much easier to make friends, much easier to make like meaningful connections with other people. And that's a very multi-layered thing. But I'm also, and I'm an interprofessional, so I always approach everything from like a sociological and a counseling standpoint, you know, so I'll ramble here and there. But I think so that the baseline is of connection among humans is different, I would say. At least for a lot of people in Germany. And then in homeless services, I think homeless services are much more diverse. That's one thing. So you have like people of all like ethnic, racial backgrounds ending up in homeless services. Also, that has partially changed. I'll come to that. Which is kind of different from the US, where it's very clear because of racial discrimination. It's not very diverse. Like the homeless population is not diverse. It's predominantly Black and brown people, predominantly low socioeconomic status. I mean, that's kind of built into, but I mean, you have people who go into homelessness from like actually having a good income and then just like falling all the way down. That happens as well. So in Germany, it's much more diverse. I think the majority of people has substance use disorders or schizophrenia. Like that's the majority of people who end up in homeless services. In the US, many more people end up in homeless services that in Germany would just not be in homeless services, you know?
Right.
Because it's people losing their job and then all of a sudden not being able to have their apartment anymore. And then they don't have a down payment. They don't have a, what's it called? The thing that,
the security deposit.
Sorry.
Yeah.
And then they don't have a security deposit and then they can't get back into housing or they have a felony and they can't find anything. So
yeah, we like to punish people for being poor.
Oh yeah. And so like just taking this aside, so the population in Germany that you have that is homeless, predominantly substance use disorder and severe mental health concerns. And for them, for sure, mental health services are important, and in a way it's easier than in the US because I think health insurance covers more and they all can get easily. Like in Germany, if you get like money from the government, like social security basically or disability money, you automatically get signed into health insurance, and they basically like there is no such thing as a copay or out-of-pocket maximum. It just doesn't exist, which is you know like those are such weird things to me in the first place in the US. But so you can get treatment, and I think you can get it way more often than in the US, or you can it's a different system. There's a lot of like versions of like involuntary commitment, to be honest, where you can basically be like, this person at this point is a danger to themselves.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can get them into some like long-term treatment program that is inpatient and they can't get out for a little bit, just to make sure that they stabilize a little bit. But it's different. And so those are a little icky, and so it's there, but it's very different than in the US. And I think there's overall just a higher tolerance for people just getting an apartment and still being heavily addicted to substances, and they can just stay in their apartment and at least not freeze to death when they're really drunk outside and pass out.
Yeah. Well, and like that idea that even people who are not actively contributing to society still deserve some quality of life. And like in America, that has always, not always, that has intentionally recently within the past 60, 70 years been reframed as a personal failing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you can tell in society in the US. I do think in a way, German society is much more tolerating of like people just maybe not being able to contribute, you know?
Yeah.
And in a way, it gives you a sense of safety when existing in the world, because you're like, okay, if something really bad happens to me, I'm not going to lose everything. And I think there's that implicit knowledge in people's brain where they're like, okay, so it's good to contribute to the system that helps people who, I mean, not everyone, obviously, but I think the majority of Germans is willing to pay for a welfare system, even if people sometimes abuse it. And that happens everywhere, you know, like, I don't know. That whole focus on like, ooh, the welfare system is being abused. I'm like, it's just every system is being abused to a certain degree, you know?
Yeah. Well, and we could fund things much better by taxing the wealthy as opposed to worrying about who's cheating the system. Like the difference there is so comically unbalanced that, again, like it's a policy choice to have the conversations we're having as opposed to being based on research or science. Like unhoused population has a lot of research on what would be beneficial, and we just don't do it because we shrugged. It's a podcast. Listeners can't see us, but we both shrugged. Like there's not a good reason to be not doing it other than capitalism doesn't want to do it.
And it seems like people are just being pit against each other. You know, it's like people with little amount of resources in comparison to people who are really rich are being pit against each other. So basically that's what that mechanism seems to be, of why people are not supporting more better welfare system, is they're like, but I don't want my little resources that I have to go to this other person over there, which I understand. I mean, everyone feels like they're so close to losing everything at all times. It makes it much harder to give away any of your money that you have. So
which also is like a feature, not a flaw within capitalism, like having it be competition based. It's from early on, from the grades you get in kindergarten and the who gets scholarships and all that stuff. It's all socializing us to be competitive and participate in that capitalism that way, instead of being like, hey, this system sucks, let's burn it down. We might get there sooner rather than later. We'll see.
I mean, it's also scarcity based. I think just thinking of scholarships, that's such a scarcity model, it's like, just any of you can get this,
So. Which, like, yes, if we just taxed rich people, we could fund it all, no problem. It's maddening as like an American. I can't imagine for you being like, oh no, like this is a problem that has been solved elsewhere, to then come over and be like, what are you all doing? This is so dumb.
I mean, honestly, I think in combination, it wouldn't be so. It's one thing to be like the system being failing. It's another thing, the system being failing and everyone walking around saying this is the greatest country on earth. That's the thing. That is really sad to me, because it kind of makes society be so resisting to any kind of change by like looking at how other places might have figured some things out,
And like, as a therapist, like I went to University of Minnesota, which is a really big research institution. So like having that background in research, it's like, this isn't even like a question of how to solve this problem. We know, we're just not doing it. And I think that makes people uncomfortable. They'd rather just woo, we're number one, instead of being like, hey, like we got some problems, let's fix it. Let's shift a little bit. Talking about immigration, you specified, and my other guest, Gabby Maniscalco, who I had on a while ago, you can scroll back into the episodes if you want to listen to that, immigrated when she was young, and so that's sort of her process. But you specifically said like the immigration process as an adult is very bizarre. Can you talk a little bit more about like that process and what you mean by that?
So I came to the US when I was 29. So I was a full-grown adult with like a fully established identity. And I do think, or I actually know, like there's research on this, but it is a very different challenge to move from having a fully established identity as a grown-up, and also possibly having a fully established career, and then moving into a place where a lot of those things don't matter anymore, and you and your way of being and who you think you are don't fit anymore in a way. And a lot of it is, I mean, it's weird because I'm a white cisgender female. So people see me and people think I'm a white American. And it's just not true. Like yes, I grew up with like Western European culture, which in a way is very, very prominent in the US. But it's a lot about what implicit norms about how people are supposed to be in the US are, and how they're different where I'm from. And so that process is when you're a child, and I listened to Gabby's episode, and it was very interesting to hear, because when you're a child, you're much more malleable and you're much more focused on like trying to fit in and like trying to like find your place in the world. But if you already have a fully established identity, that is really hard, because you're like, it's not like, how can I make myself fit into this? You're like, why do I not fit into this? You know what I mean? It's like, it's like as if you, I don't know, I have like these kids sorting toys where you have like a star and a square and a triangle and stuff. And you're like a square who's supposed to fit through the star, and you just don't fit. And when you're a kid, you can maybe like still shape it, but you just don't. And it's like, it's a very, very painful process of trying to find a way of like keeping your identity without fully giving yourself up, and still fitting into this new society.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know, I don't know, I can imagine. There's research, I've read it,
Yeah.
but without experiencing. I know the immigration process for marginalized communities, particularly Black and Brown people, like there's a lot of inherent racism, and we talk about microaggressions. Those are things we study, but you're talking about, like, as a white lady, like so you maybe pass the quote unquote eye test, but then like there's still this in-group out-group that like you're butting up against regularly. What is that? Is that similar? Not similar to the racism inherent, but like microaggressions, and like what is that experience for you where you're like, oh, like, yep, I'm okay until they hear my accent, or I'm okay until I don't do this social norm, and then like what's that pushback look like?
I think my I don't think my accent ever is an issue. Like that I'm okay there. I'm like, honestly it's visual. It's more like I dress weird for most people, and so in the Midwest that's kind of weird for some reason. But
you're a therapist, so we're sort of allowed to dress weird. So
yeah, but not in school. Like when I went to
that's true.
counseling school, I was like always the odd one out, and I was like, weird. I don't know what's going on here. But I think there's a lot of like lack of cultural knowledge in the US, or especially in the Midwest. Like I used to live in Southern California. My partner's from the East Coast. I've been at the East Coast a lot. And I think those are much more like diverse places in a way, culturally diverse places. And people there whom I worked with and whom I encountered had an understanding for the fact that not everyone has the same social norms, the same communication skills, or not. It's not about skills, but communication norms. You know, they'd be much more giving and like understanding when you would, for example, say something that they thought was rude. They'd be like, you know, we think this is rude. And then you come to the Midwest, and the Midwest has very implicit communication norms. It's very for white people. So this is the thing. All of this is like white middle class, basically. But white middle class American, Midwestern culture is very subtle, very confrontational, very passive aggressive. But the thing is, they don't, like, most people have not enough understanding for what it is like to be in a place that is different from them culturally, to at least give you the grace to tell you, hey, we do this differently. You know, they just instantly hate you. You know, they're like, and then they don't tell you, and then like weeks later or months later, you just know that there's like something going on, and I'm like, what is going on? Like, have I done something wrong? I'm like, no. And I feel like that is a form of microaggression, honestly, because I think, and that is not just me, like it's like a lot of people who are not white middle class Americans experience this, where there's just like the subtlety in communication where people just assume that you can read their mind. You know, and there is no communication of like, what are actually the norms that you're having? What, like, people just assume because you violated norms that there's something wrong with you and you're mean. And that was very, very stressful for me for a long period of time here, because I just couldn't figure out the communication norms. You know, it's like, I don't, because there's no feedback. You know, there's no feedback loop in a way, no direct feedback.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. As a native Midwesterner, like we talk about Midwest nice, like everyone here is nice, but like there's no conflict resolution. It is just like it's nice for the sake of being nice, but it's not actually connective. There's no depth to it. We won't insult you, but like we will silently judge you from far away and then not deal with you anymore. Like it is very the in-group out-group dynamic is very strong, and then it's got this sheen of like pleasantries over it that makes it very hard to decipher.
Yeah, and honestly, it feels aggressive when you are on the receiving end and like can't fit in, you know. Because there's no, you're not allowed to bring up the conflict, you know. You're not allowed to say
that's That's rude that you're bringing it up.
Rude. And then that is unto itself such a strong social norm, like
Yeah.
I and I come from a country where we complain about things as a way of connecting with each other. In Germany,
Sure.
when you meet someone new and the first thing you're trying to do is find a thing that you can complain about together,
Yeah.
and there is a level of great connection in that. And I think a lot of people in the Midwest find that very weird. They think that you're always complaining about everything. That's not the case. It's just a way of feeling it out.
Yeah.
And so I think that was really weird. Yeah, that is just those things just don't go together very well. And Germans are known, and not every German is the same. By no means, I'm not on time, because everyone's always like, Germans are on time. I'm not on time. I'm sorry about that. But but there is definitely, German culture is much more direct, and it's very solution focused in a way. It's
Yeah.
we want to make things better, so let's try to figure out what didn't go well. So you might get some feedback where someone's going to be like, that didn't work, let's do it differently next time. And if you try that here, people feel so offended,
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things I work with is religious trauma, and there's this concept we call spiritual bypassing, where people won't do the hard emotional work to just pretend that everything's okay. They'd rather just feel okay than actually make things good. And that's a very Midwestern thing too.
Yeah.
That we'd rather have everything feel okay and not have to be uncomfortable, not have to address anything. And even if it sucks, we're all just kind of okay with it, is better than actually addressing it head on. And so there's a lot of emotional bypassing that goes on just as a way to not feel uncomfortable.
And the interesting thing though is, I think if you come from a culture that doesn't do that, you don't have that space of emotional bypassing. You won't feel okay if there's conflict.
Yeah.
You just there and you're like, what is going on? What is going on? What is going on? And you're trying to find out what is going on. People won't tell you. And so
and I see it in religion elsewhere, but it is a geographic Midwestern thing, because my sister-in-law is from New York, and her integration into our family was very chaotic, because New Yorkers just talk about shit, and they'll cuss you out and then hug you and you're all good, and that is not what happens in the Midwest. That's very, very uncomfortable. So I think again, East Coast, West Coast have their own. America's such a big, expansive geography that the cultural norms are very regional.
Yeah, they're very regional. And I think that's why I said East Coast works way better for me. West Coast works way better for me, just because there's a different cultural norms. So I think that was really hard in the US. And I think honestly the Midwest is particular kind of misogyny. So that's another thing. You're an outspoken woman, that gives you a completely different level of anger that you receive.
What I'm curious, I have two questions. Because Wisconsin specifically, and the Midwest in general, but Wisconsin specifically is very German settlers are who settled Wisconsin. So I'm curious, as an immigrant coming from Germany, does that sort of track? Can we see where it shifted from German culture to whatever the Midwest culture is now? And then two, I'm curious to talk more about this specific misogyny.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a very interesting one, because when I first came to Milwaukee, a lot of people are like, oh, so many cultural German clubs. and you'll feel just like home. And then I think one has to understand that, so Germany it's not a small country. It's as big as California, as twice the population. And it has a lot of different cultural permutations, a lot. Yeah. So having a German club that covers it all is very bizarre to me in the first place. Sure. I'm I understand people have and there's this whole thing where culture can't be preserved in time either, so the culture that you have in those German clubs is way old, and for me, icky, because the majority of immigrants who came to Wisconsin from Germany came before World War I between World War I and World War II and after World War II, and that is always kind of like, what's your, like,
yeah,
what's your relationship to Nazi Germany? That's always kind of the implicit. So I'm kind of, and modern day Germany doesn't want to have anything to do with that. So so culturally, I think I haven't noticed very much. I mean, I'm from a majority culture in Germany. So I'm like, it's very hard to actually have an objective view on yourself when you're part of the majority culture or like the dominant culture.
Yeah.
So I cannot tell how much of like Wisconsin culture is German culture in terms of like communication culture, and other things. I just can't tell. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I can say that the umtata, you call it polka. It's not polka. Polka is a Polish thing. But like they do that one really well, actually. That shit we do have it. Sorry, I cursed a lot. At,
you're good.
At Oktoberfest, we have that. And like exactly the same music. And it's always really funny to me because I'm like, this is so bizarre. So,
yeah. I'm one half of my family is nearly all German. And the Schumacher side.
Yeah. I could tell. I was like, yeah.
Yeah, shockingly. But like very German Lutheran. And so like I had a great grandpa who preached, who still did his sermons in German. And so like my experience of my cultural heritage has always been far more Lutheran than anything else. It's always been based on the religious thing than any of the German thing like that. I don't know, I drink Jägermeister, like that's maybe the most like German thing I do. And that sounds so like that's how little I know about German culture, right? Like that just even if that's in America, even if that's your ethnic heritage, like there's not a great connection to that. It's still acculturating to the majority population in your geographic location is still the preferred outcome than maintaining that cultural heritage.
Yeah. And I mean, at the same time, I do understand why people do that. Like I think it's like a sense of like trying to understand where you belong and where you come from. And like, I understand that. And in a way, I feel like my approach to German culture comes from a very privileged position where it's just a given. Like, I just like all of those, like, I don't need those cultural things. Like, I mean, I did like Oktoberfest can be a fun thing, but besides that, I don't need any of the, like, I don't need a dirndl, I don't need I don't need lederhosen. And those, by the way, are basically like Southern German culture. That's like Texas, basically. So most of the things that you have in the US is like, this is German culture, is basically Bavarian culture, and Bavaria is basically Texas of Germany. So
that's terrible news for someone who's from Wisconsin, and most of my German culture is tied to Oktoberfest things.
So that, but for me, like, I don't need that. Like, there's this historical groundedness that comes with being from a space where you just know its history like so far back. And you're like, when I'm in Germany, or even when I'm at the East Coast, when I see like old, like really old stone walls, I feel grounded, which is very bizarre. Like, I just like in Germany, everything is my hometown is 1,000 years old, like that's how far we can track it. That's when the first document came out. They have like way older, like, signs of settlements that they keep on digging out accidentally. And then they're like, well, don't know what to do with this, gonna close it. Someone looked at it, because there's just so much history everywhere. And I do think humans have that desire to create that for themselves. They want to feel like deep historical roots in some way or shape. And I think that is what that is for people in the US. And I don't blame them. It just has nothing to do with me and my Germanness, Yeah.
Well, and this is a topic I'm not interested in pursuing too far because it is so expansive. But like, there's an argument that like American whiteness is not a culture in and of itself. And so it's a bizarre sort of grasping and like oversimplifying other cultural norms and like then amplifying it and making that your personality. And like that doesn't have a lot of depth. That doesn't have that connection to the past or that sort of ability to like really dig in. Like, American culture is incredibly malleable. And for people who are trying to connect to something, there's not always a lot to go back to.
I hear that. I actually don't think it's very malleable though, which is interestingly. I think it's like it doesn't have, I don't know. It's a deep like
Yeah, maybe malleable was the wrong word. Like it's not rooted in anything.
it's not rooted. Yeah. I don't
Yeah.
think it's rooted, and I think that creates a particular kind of like collective anxiety in a way.
Yeah.
And dependence on artificial forms of identity, or like capitalism, honestly,
Right.
is
Yeah.
a collective identity.
Yeah. Or what kind of truck you drive, like
yeah,
as your identity.
yeah. And so, yeah, I think it in a way it makes the white United States, white US culture more vulnerable to like external influences on what culture supposedly is.
Yeah, which we're seeing in real time.
Yeah. I had a very awful thought. Do you want to hear it?
Yes, absolutely. Let's record it.
That's the place that Germany was in the late 1900s, 1800s.
Yeah.
The like grasp for national identity that is like,
yeah, and at least for young white American males, like that connection's very strong for like, yep, early, pre-World War I Germany, like
yeah,
the quality of life was high enough that young people coming up didn't have that sort of like, this is what the previous generations had to do work for it, and they were angry because they weren't social climbing, and they were looking for people to get angry at. And like that messaging is, again, like American culture not being rooted, it is easy to like capture large swaths of the population by selling them a simple narrative. Like
yeah.
So that's the right-wing political movement right now, and the reason, this is a soapbox for me, but the reason it is linked up with conservative Christianity is because like both of those things are selling an in-group out-group dynamic that captures a lot of people who don't have a culture to fall back on or a community that they're already connected with.
Yeah.
Super fun. What an uplifting topic.
Yeah.
Let's go back briefly, and I want to be respectful of your time here, but like, can you say a little bit more about the unique misogyny to the Midwest?
I think in the Midwest, women are preferred to be quiet and not visible. That's kind of, and there's really not much space for like, especially like white women. And I mean, I think women of color have the issue that like all the women are supposed to be quiet and not outspoken, and there's not much it's not tolerated any other way, very much. And I haven't experienced that like that anywhere else, like there's just like most of the outspoken women I know in the Midwest feel completely misplaced. Like, people just think you're a bully, basically. And
so do you have a hypothesis on what that's from?
I think it's misogyny. I think it's that's I think it really is that there's a cultural norm about like a very strong cultural norm about how women are supposed to be, and it's a very narrow cultural norm. It's not that you're like, okay, a woman can be this, a woman can be this, a woman can be this. It's like, no, a woman is not supposed to stick out, and she's not supposed to be loud, and she's not supposed to and disrupt the peace. I mean, I think in general, it's like disrupting the peace is the ultimate offense in the Midwest. But men have like outlets for that. Men are allowed that. Men are allowed to be like loud and rowdy and like, because then they're just a dude. Women are not.
Right. Yeah. And that's interesting, because I grew up a fundamentalist religion, very Lutheran, and so did my wife. And we've both since left the church, and it's a very different experience. Like, she as a outspoken female was like doubly transgressive because of the geography, but then because of the religious norm. Like, we were raised Lutheran, women can't even vote still in the Lutheran church. So like, that's how transgressive it was to be not only good at her job and like smart and critical thinking, but then outspoken about it. And so, you know, I'm aware of that within the church. A main reason for both of us leaving the church as we got older, but like also it's interesting to hear like that's not just the church, that's our lived experience, but like that's the entire geography.
I think it's the entire geography of like white norms in the Midwest. And speaking of religion, I just recently learned of this Indian goddess Durga, who is like a really powerful goddess in Shaktism, I think. But so what is interesting about that, it blew my mind that there would be a goddess-centric religion. That was never even a possibility in my brain.
Yeah.
And I think that shows something about most religion, like it shows kind of like the built-in misogyny in most religious systems, that we don't even think about the option of a powerful woman.
Yeah. Well, and America was founded by a bunch of weird religious zealots who were fleeing from Europe for religious discrimination. Like Pennsylvania was set up by a bunch of weird Quakers who made Quaker oatmeal so that they didn't get horny from having spicy foods. Like, and that sounds so ridiculous, but like I'm not wrong. That's true.
It's true.
So it's just this weird like dichotomy, like that a lot of that patriarchy and misogyny is built in from like who was setting up the country and creating some of those social norms, and then the groups that are actively fighting to keep that going.
Yeah. And it doesn't benefit them. That's a sad thing. Like I'm such a big fan of like trying to, I mean, the difference between like within each sex, the personality difference like it's bigger than between the different sexes, you know, like if you like see what kind of personality people have within one sex, like that, like in the end we're all super diverse no matter what sex or gender we have. And the idea that everyone is supposed to like just fit into this one narrow norm doesn't benefit anyone. Like and I think it doesn't benefit men either. Like it doesn't, like not being allowed like a more emotional, more intuitive, more gentle existence is really sad.
These social norms are all about social control, and so like participating in it keeps you sort of captured in that very narrow lane. This is all so good to talk about. I love there's so much more because we didn't even talk about the perinatal stuff and the motherhood stuff that you work with, but maybe we'll have you on again soon and talk about some of that. But Madeleine, if people want to learn about you, if they're interested in the immigrant experience, or they're an immigrant themselves looking for some support, if they're hearing what we're saying and knowing we're talking about intersectionality, even though we haven't said that word out loud yet, but they want to work with someone who understands that, where can they go? How can they find your work? How can they connect with you?
I think the easiest way is to just go to my website, which is wildflowermke.com, and just connect with me. There's more info about me, my email. Just shoot me an email. I think that's the easiest way. And
for sure. And we'll have your website and socials and stuff on the show notes so people can click over there and find it really easily.
Awesome.
This has been lovely. Thank you so much for joining us. It is. It goes by quickly, especially when we talk about the big complex social topics. So no, this has been awesome. Appreciate you taking the time to join me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And to all our wonderful listeners, thanks for tuning in again this week. We will be back next week with another new episode. Take care, everyone.